His house was an old and large building situated at the end of a cul-de-sac. Kamran had lost his wife years ago, and since then, he had been living alone in that large house. The only keepsake he had of his wife was a photograph placed on the mantelpiece. At night, when shadows grew long and the silence enveloped the town, strange sounds could be heard emanating from the walls of the house. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridors, sometimes the sound of a bell that seemed to come from a distant room, and occasionally whispers as if seeping out from the walls themselves. Kamran initially tried to ignore these sounds, but as time went on, they intensified, and he could no longer remain indifferent. One night, when the footsteps seemed to approach his bedroom, Cameron decided to uncover the mystery of these sounds once and for all. With the flashlight in hand, Kamran moved towards the sounds. Each step he took, his heart beat faster, and his breath echoed in the night silence. He reached a door that was closed. This room had been his wife's bedroom when she was alive, and since her death, Kamran had never entered it. With trembling hands, he turned the key in the lock and opened the door. The room was dark and cold, with an air of mustiness and dampness. Kamran lifted the flashlight and swept its beam around the room. Suddenly, his eyes fell on something that made his breath catch in his throat. His wife's picture, which was always on the mantelpiece, was now on the bed, and her eyes seemed to follow him. At that moment, the sound of the bell he had heard earlier rang out again. The sound came from under the bed. Kamran. With fear taking root in his being, Kamran looked under the bed. What he saw shook him to the core. An old doll, with eyes that seemed to sparkle under the flashlight's beam, was nestled there. It was a doll his wife had bought years ago for the child they never had. With shaking hands, Kamran picked up the doll. At that moment, he heard a voice seemingly coming from the walls, saying, "Why did you leave me?" He looked around, but saw no one. The voice repeated, this time closer and clearer. Kamran moved towards the sound and touched the wall from where it emanated. Suddenly, the wall gently moved, revealing a hidden room to him. Behind the wall was a secret chamber filled with old belongings and forgotten memories. Cameron entered with a mix of wonder and dread. The beam of his flashlight fell upon a diary that seemed to belong to his wife. He opened it and began to read. With each page he turned, more secrets of his past were revealed, secrets he never knew existed. Cameron flipped through the diary with trembling hands. Each memory he read unveiled a new secret. He came upon a page written in a hasty, shaky script. It said that his wife, Layla, felt an invisible force following her, a force that woke her from sleep and whispered things only she could hear. Kamran looked on in shock and horror. Layla had written that this force was drawing her to a room in the basement, a room Kamran never knew existed. He decided to go down to the basement and find the hidden room. With a flashlight emitting a feeble light, Kamran made his way to the basement stairs. With each step down, the whispers grew louder. When he reached the basement, he found that the hidden room was behind a bookshelf that needed to be moved aside. With all his might, he pushed the shelf aside and opened the door to the room. Inside, there were statues of old dolls and antique objects, each seeming to have its own story. In the center of the room, there was a small table, and on it, an open book lay. Kamran approached the book and gently placed his hand on its cover. The book, with pages that seemed centuries old, was open. It was filled with writings in an unknown language and strange symbols etched into them. Kamran cautiously began to read, and with each word, he felt the air in the room grow heavier. Suddenly, a sound came from behind him, a voice that seemed to come from afar, and at that moment, his flashlight went out. Kamran was plunged into complete darkness. He tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it was futile. In that darkness, he felt that he was not alone, that something or someone was there with him. With fear rooting deep within him, Cameron listened intently to his surroundings. The sound of breathing that was not in sync with his own. The sound of footsteps slowly approaching him. And at that moment, he felt a cold, lifeless hand rest upon his shoulder. Kamran, consumed by fear, turned around. But there was no one behind him. The sound of breathing continued, but this time it was coming from above him. He looked up to see shadows moving on the ceiling, as if they were alive and crawling across the room's surface. Kamran, now forgetting his fear of everything else, searched for an escape. He ran towards the door he had entered through, but it was closed. The whispers and footsteps now seemed to come from all directions, and Kamran felt as if the walls were closing in on him. At that moment, one of the old dolls on the table began to move in a peculiar way. The doll, whose eyes seemed to sparkle with an invisible light, turned towards Kamran and spoke with a voice that could not possibly come from any throat. "Kamran, you have always been here." Kamran, who could no longer distinguish between reality and imagination, fell to the ground and, drawing heavy breaths, he tried to gather himself but felt an odd heaviness. It was as if an invisible force was pressing him down to the ground. The sound of footsteps now came from all directions, and the shadows on the walls and ceiling moved in strange, unsettling patterns. At that moment, one of the dolls, its eyes still flickering, slowly crawled towards him. Kamran watched in horror. The doll opened its mouth, and with a voice that seemed to come from another world said, "The time has come for you to know the truth." Suddenly, the book on the table started flipping pages on its own. The pages turned rapidly until they stopped on a specific page. On that page was a map that appeared to be of the same house, but with rooms Kamran had never seen before. Kamran studied the map carefully and realized there was another hidden room. He decided to search for it. With fear and trepidation, he got up and moved towards the location indicated on the map. With each step, the whispers and footsteps grew louder, but he was determined to uncover the truth. Kamran looked into the hidden room. What he saw filled him with terror. In the center of the room stood a large mirror that showed a different image of him, an image where Kamran appeared older and more tired, and beside him stood a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Layla. Kamran slowly moved towards the mirror and reached out towards the image. At that moment, he felt a hand from inside the mirror reach out and pull him in. Kamran was drawn into the mirror with fear and disbelief, lost in that parallel world. In the parallel world, Kamran faced a reality he could never have imagined. He realized that his life with Layla, all their memories and experiences, were just part of an imaginary world created by supernatural forces. Layla had never died. Instead, she and Kamran had always lived in this parallel world. Kamran came to terms with this new truth and decided to live alongside Layla in this new world. He no longer feared the shadows and whispering voices, for he knew they were all part of the world he now inhabited. And so it was that Kamran and Layla lived together again, in a world beyond human imagination. Kamran's story in our world came to an end, but in another, new adventures awaited him.